right, wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Abra Risi, and I am the Interim Director of Member Engagement and Communications with the PFC team. So I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Lobbying for Change. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Abra Risi et je vous souhaite la bienvenue au webinaire d'aujourd'hui au sujet de le lobbying pour le changement. I'm also acting as the host of today's event, which is bringing people together from across the country to listen into this important conversation. So thank you for joining us today. We always like to start out with a land acknowledgement, which helps us to recognize history, prompts us to think about how our relationship to the land informs where we are now, encourages us to reflect on what changes we can make as a sector and beyond, and in our commitment to reconciliation. So I'm joining you today from downtown Toronto within the bounds of Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Toronto is within the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Our relationship to the land and getting to know the land is important, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work and live here. And as we're gathering together today to meet, tuning in from many locations across the country, I encourage you to reflect on the land that you are joining us from today. So just a few housekeeping things to share. As PFC is a national organization, we function in both English and French. Today's session is being offered in English with French interpretation. So if you click the globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can choose the language you would like to hear in real time. We have our interpreter, Justin, working in real time. So l'atelier d'aujourd'hui est proposé en anglais. Pourtant, nous offrons une interprétation en français. Donc, si vous cliquez sur le globe en bas de votre écran de Zoom, vous aurez l'occasion de choisir la langue que vous préférez. So we have just under an hour together today. And because we're such a large group, we are in webinar format here on Zoom. So webinar format means that you can hear and see us, but we cannot see you as we would in a Zoom meeting. So because of that, we encourage you to use the Q&A function to communicate with us, which is also at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And that's the place to post any questions you would like to bring to the attention of our panelists. And we'll then get to them during the question and answer period of our time together. And note, the Q&A function is different than the chat. And lastly, today's session is being recorded, and PFC will put the video out on our YouTube channel in the days ahead. We'll also share the materials with registrants following today's webinar that we will have seen here. So we are offering this webinar thanks to the contribution of PFC member, the Trottier Family Foundation. Thanks to the Trottier Foundation support, this webinar is open to charities and foundations across the sector at large. So because of that, some of you are joining us from outside the PFC network, and that means you might not know who we are. So let me just say a few words about Philanthropic Foundations Canada, aka PFC. So we are a registered charity and Canada's national philanthropic network for grant makers. So it serves to strengthen Canadian philanthropy. Our membership and community works together in pursuit of a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. Our membership is composed of public and private foundations, charities, corporate giving programs, donor advised funds, and nonprofits whose primary function and activity is grant making. So in partnership with our diverse network and in partnership with civil society, business, and government, PFC serves to advance the common good. So through capacity building programs, collaboration initiatives, and policy and research. So today's webinar is part of our Together 25 webinar series, which is connected to the themes of PFC's upcoming 2024 National Conference, which is taking place in Ottawa between September 23rd and 25th. So mark your calendars for September 2024, and note that registration will be opening later in the spring. So marking PFC's 25th anniversary, our 2024 conference will be our biggest one yet, actually. It's bringing PFC members, friends, partners, leaders in the philanthropy and grant-making sector together to share, learn, and explore new ideas for how philanthropy can tackle the urgent challenges of our time. This session is also being offered as part of our network's communications affinity group, programming. So the Communications Affinity Group meets monthly and is regular learning and or a regular learning and convening initiative for those in our sector who manage strategic communications. So for the comms professionals out there listening in today who aren't already part of the Affinity Group, if you'd like to learn more about the group, I invite you to visit the PFC website for more info. So on today's topic, at this webinar, we are going to provide a high-level overview of why foundations and other charities may want to consider lobbying, what the rules around lobbying are, and other practical considerations our presenters may wish to share with you today. So I will now introduce our speakers. Sarah Krunitsky is the Director of Public Affairs and Research at PFC. Sarah has worked in the sector for more than 20 years with many roles that have put her career at the intersection of philanthropy, the charitable sector, and public policy. So she is a leading sector expert on charity policy and was recently invited to sit on the Technical Issues Working Group for the Charities Directorate at the CRA. So Sarah will start off the conversation by providing an overview of why political activities and lobbying are important considerations for foundations and other charities. But first, it's my pleasure to also introduce Karen Cooper from Cooper Law. So Karen has had a diverse and distinguished career as a charity lawyer and has extensive experience working with and advising a wide range of charities and foundations. So we are absolutely delighted that Karen is here today as our main guest speaker. And she'll talk to you about what you need to know about registering for as a lobbyist and for lobbying. And we'll speak to the related legal and practical aspects related to lobbying. So there we go. Enough out of me. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Abra. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before I pass it over to Karen. But I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the why. So why should charities lobby? Why engage in political activities? So I've got two reasons that I want to just walk people through for a few minutes. So the first is that political activities are charitable activities. Some people might know that years ago it was the fact that charities in Canada could only use up to 10% of their resources towards political activities. And there was confusion and alarm in our sector about this for a really long time. When I started my career, that certainly was the case. There was a lot of fear about getting it wrong, getting audited, even losing charitable status. And I'm not going to go into the history of this, but I just want to acknowledge that these were real fears and legitimate concerns. But that is in the past. And I do still encounter the persistence of these fears today. And so even though that 10% rule and the old rules haven't been the case for many, many years. And I know that Karen's going to delve into a lot more of this later in the webinar, so I'm not going to go into the details, but I just wanted to really highlight this residual misunderstanding that political activities, actually can be charitable activities. So I thought it was really important. That's why I wanted to kind of start the webinar off just to underscore that message. And then my second message about the why is that about why charities should engage in political activities is because government really needs us to do this. Democracy depends on civil society to inform government, and because charities are an essential part of civil society. So we actually have a really important role. Government can't be expected to know everything, nor should they. And what's more is that if we don't help them, someone else will, and they do. And who is better informed about policies in the public interest than charities? Business, private interest groups, I'm not so sure. We're not beholden to shareholders. We're beholden to the common good. We're beholden to the people who benefit from the programs and the services that we deliver. And we know them. We know who they are, and we have a responsibility to advocate for them. Without our engagement in the political process, the government is far less likely to consider their needs or do so adequately. So I want to, before I pass it over to Karen, I just want to tell you a little story to hit home this point. About 20 years ago, I was a parliamentary intern working on Parliament Hill with a parliamentary internship program. It's a nonpartisan program that gave me placements embedded into the offices of two MPs in Ottawa. So I worked with one MP in government, one MP in opposition. I worked for a rural Conservative MP, and I also worked for a New Democrat MP in an urban downtown riding. And I have to say, it really was really eye-opening and mind-blowing. And I'll tell you why. Because at the start of the program, there was a federal election. So the interns that year had a really unique opportunity to be on the Hill to welcome new MPs to Ottawa. Now, these new MPs were smart, interesting people from across the country, from all different kinds of backgrounds and professions, teachers, lawyers, farmers, business owners, you name it. And they arrived on the Hill knowing very, very little about their job. But while they had a steep learning curve, they learned a lot. And what's more is they learn quickly. How and what do they learn? Well, they learned how to learn, and they did that mostly through meetings and phone calls. So I saw firsthand how their offices were revolving doors of people from their ridings and others representing issues that they and their constituents cared about. They were, when they weren't on the floor of the House of Commons or in committee, I'm telling you, they were in meetings with constituents or other experts in the field, telling them about issues that they and their constituents cared about, or they were at events talking about the same thing, or on and on and on. You get the idea. They spent a lot of time talking to people. And this was the same for both of the MPs that I worked for, the different parties. It's the same for the MPs of all the other interns that year. And to this day, I have many friends who work in politics and in government relations, and it's still the same. So what I want to say is that, you know, of those calls and those meetings, the majority of the folks were people from business and from other sectors other than charities. And that really is the reason why today I have a job where I work for a charity and do public policy. And it's also why when I was chatting with the folks at Trottier Foundation about the idea of a webinar about charities and lobbying, I was pretty excited. If you know me, some of you might know me, you know that I'm really passionate about the role of charities in the policymaking process. And it's because we are essential. We do some of the most important work in this country. And yet the fact is that we are a blip on the screen for most politicians. But the good news is that there is incredible opportunity for us to do better. A key learning for me when I was on the Hill was, honestly, no matter the party, no matter the person, no matter the partisan leaning, the vast majority of the people there genuinely wanted to make a difference. And while they might have different ideas about how to do that, their hearts are in the right place. But what they need is the right information, the right stories, the truths that you and I see every day, and the ideas about how to make things better. So if there's one message I want to leave you with today, it's that charities belong in politics. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Karen, who's going to tell you more about how to do it right, and what you need to think about when you're doing it. So over to you, Karen, and I will pull up your PowerPoint.
Thanks, Sarah. I really do appreciate the introduction and the emphasis on the why. This is important. I too have been in the sector for an awful long time and experienced the chill. In fact, I was in the trenches with some of those charities that got audited way back when. And I'm happy sort of that the rules have changed and that to some degree the chill has lifted. But I concur that there remains this misunderstanding out there in respect of where we're at for charities and political activities. So I still don't see my PowerPoint up there. Do I need to pull it up, or?
I have it shared. Just do folks not see it?
I still see yours up there.
Okay, let me try again. I will stop share and try again. Apologies.
No, not at all. In any event, by way of overview, some of the stuff that I'm going to cover is that background, a little bit of the history, but more to highlight what charities can do at present. And it's in the context of what now you can do under CRA rules that lobbying rules then become important, because there's this wider scope for what charities can do. I believe that the emphasis in terms of regulation is going to shift from the CRA to some of these other regulators to ensure that charities, when they're engaging in advocacy, which was a bad word at some point, but when they're engaging in advocacy work, they're going to comply with the other rules. So I'm now at slide 2 in terms of the background. There were these audits it was largely environmental organizations, but some other organizations, both sides of the spectrum. There was an election, there was a consultation panel, there was a court case, and then we got these new rules in 2018, and they were retroactive to 2008. And now, under these new rules, and I'm ahead a slide, the charities can engage in unlimited public policy dialogue and development activities. They're called PDAs. It's an odd acronym, but if you're talking CRA speak with anybody, they refer to PDAs. And so you can engage in these activities without limit. You just have to still stay away from partisan activities. So that's what you're now allowed to do. On the next slide, I take a definition that was found in the technical papers accompanying the legislative change. And it's also in the guidance on what charities can do. And that definition includes seeking to influence the laws, policies, or decisions of a government, whether in Canada or a foreign country, by providing information, research, opinions, advocacy, mobilizing others, representation, providing forums, and convening discussions. So these are all activities that charities, including grant-making organizations, can engage in without limit. So these are charitable activities under CRA rules now. And it's really important for organizations now, when they engage in these activities, that they comply with the other regulatory requirements. So in my view, the enforcement, if there is any enforcement, is going to perhaps shift from CRA as the regulator to these other organizations that regulate lobbying, and then also election rules. We're heading into an election period, both in Ontario and at the federal level. And I didn't want this opportunity to go by without reminding organizations that there are also these rules that I'm not speaking about today around election compliance. And they do intersect with the CRA rules and with the lobbying rules, because as I said earlier, there remains this prohibition on partisan activities. So that was my introduction, a bit of a background for you. If we could go on to the next slide, I just wanted to cover what are the jurisdictions with lobbying laws. So I don't know what jurisdictions all of you work in or focus on, but this slide is just a bit of a reminder that when it comes to lobbying legislation, it is an example of federalism at work, right? It's a patchwork. We've got legislation at the federal level, each of the provinces, and some of our major municipalities. And it depends on the kind of work and who you are communicating with, which jurisdiction and what body of laws applies. And this is important, both so that you're aware of what are the technical rules should you engage, but it's also an important piece of information because, in fact, my, I guess, message or theme is that organizations should actually focus less on the technical. Do you know, is this lobbying? Do I fit? Have I met the threshold, etc., and have an honest conversation within the organization. And are they going to get into communications, and are they going to engage in providing advice and information to public office holders? And if they are, you know, notwithstanding the technical requirements, because they vary across the country and depending on the jurisdiction, it might make sense to consider registering in any event. Because as a lawyer, if I'm engaged and I'm having to provide technical advice to get an organization out of a tough spot, then in my experience, you've almost already lost, right? And far better to be ahead of the game than to be, fixing something after the fact. You'll also, in my experience, know that I am finding that compliance with lobbying registration requirements is becoming more and more the ethical and transparent thing to do, because that's the principle that underlies lobbying registration as opposed to perhaps other regulatory regimes. This is really all about transparency, right? And being straight up about who you as organizations are talking to. And here again, this is a conversation that the organization should be having with itself about what side of that discussion they want to be on. And my experience is that the trend is increasingly towards more and more openness and transparency. Nonetheless, we'll spend some time looking at what is the definition of lobbying. So I've moved on to the next slide. At the federal level, and I've largely used the federal legislation to provide you with sort of the general rules and the generalities around this legislation, mostly because most organizations are working at the federal level, though a good number are also working at the provincial and municipal level. In any event, for the federal legislation, pardon me, lobbying is defined as communicating with public office holders for payment with regard to the making, developing, or amending federal legislative proposals, bills, or resolutions, regulations, policies, or programs. Big tick box. You're now allowed to do that as registered charities. Those are PDAs. So go, right? You can also communicate with them with respect to the awarding of federal grants, contributions, or other financial benefits. While most of the organizations here may be grant-making organizations and aren't necessarily on the receiving end of federal grants, it's important to highlight that that's also included in the definition. Some of the case law that's come out has in fact related to communications with federal office holders with respect to grants. They are the high profile media type engagements that get organizations into trouble. And I don't want organizations to forget that those kinds of communications are included in the definition of lobbying. In the case of consultant lobbyists, there's also the inclusion of the awarding of federal government contracts and arranging meetings. I don't want to get too much into the difference between the rules for in-house lobbyists and consultant lobbyists, but know that the definition is quite wide. When we talk about in-house lobbyists, we're talking about lobbyists that are engaging for an employer. So this is people like Sarah, for instance, and maybe Abra, right? They're considered in-house lobbyists, whereas a consultant lobbyist is somebody who's on the outside, somebody that you pay, a GR Consulting Corporation. And there are some technical differences in the application of the legislation there. Typical definitions also include any communications with public office holders in an attempt to influence. Depends on the jurisdiction. Sometimes there is no added, sort of threshold that you have to attempt to influence. Just simply circulating information may not meet a lobbying definition in one jurisdiction. It only meets the definition if you're trying to influence in some jurisdictions. Here again, a technical difference. I think you have to assume for the purposes of the conversation, I'm encouraging that any communication with public office holders is going to be caught. And the subject matter, bills, regs, policies, grants, contracts, those kinds of things. Another piece that people don't realize is that some jurisdictions include mass media, direct communication, for instance, social media campaigns as communications for the purposes of compliance with this legislation. So it's important to remember that if you use any form of mass media, social media kind of campaign, it might be caught. It's viewed as indirect attempts to influence public policy holders. And so when you're looking at whether or not you meet a particular threshold and whether or not you have to report, it's important to remember that sometimes those kinds of activities are also going to be caught. Now, remember, those activities are also permitted under the new CRA rules, so go for it. The lobbying legislation is just simply a requirement to perhaps register and report it. So the lobbying legislation doesn't say don't do it. It's just simply saying if you do it, you might have to register and you might have to report it. On to the next slide, a couple of things that isn't lobbying. And so you wouldn't necessarily have to track it and report it, or if it's all that you do, it won't trigger a registration requirement. This would include any oral or written submissions made to a committee in the House or the Senate, tribunal, court, that kind of thing. Communications with public office holders where the nature of the communication is strictly a request for information. The problem with that one is you ask for information and then what do you do and what is the next communication is where oftentimes clients can get into trouble. You ask for the information, that doesn't count, but it's the next steps that may or may not trigger the application of the lobbying legislation. Simple communications around interpretation or enforcement of law, administration of a program, none of those count. Another important exception, I think, for people in this sector is communications by volunteers. So if your board engages with public office holders and they're volunteers, they should all be unpaid directors or certainly not paid by the organization, then those engagements don't count. The problem we encounter is some of the folks on our boards wear multiple hats, right? And they may be communicating with a public office holder wearing a different hat. And so it is important for our volunteer directors to at least be mindful and aware that this legislation, they may have an exemption because they're a volunteer for your organization, but that conversation may trigger the application of the legislation because of who their employer is or their other activities. The next bullet really is, I'm highlighting some of the exceptions and the differences. Note that Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, and Saskatchewan exempt nonprofit entities. So if your engagement is limited to those jurisdictions, you may not have to worry about lobbying registration. I highlighted already, there's really two types of lobbyists, the consultants and then the in-house lobbyists. Most of you are dealing with in-house lobbying activity where you're communicating with office holders on behalf of the corporation that employs you. Registration is required when one or more employees communicate with public office holders regarding those various subjects and where those duties constitute a significant part of the duties. Now, what's a significant part and all of that varies depending on the jurisdiction. But as soon as someone in the organization communicates with public office holders, you then have to look and determine exactly who is communicating, engaging in these activities, and add up all the time that they take when engaging in those activities, and then determine whether that time meets certain thresholds. So under the federal rules, and I'm on to the next slide, registration for in-house lobbyists is required where the accumulated activity of all employees involved in lobbying constitutes a significant part, which is interpreted as 20% or more of the duties of one FTE. So it may be that your CEO, executive director does some, you've got a communications officer, you've got other folks who do perhaps social media engagement. You would add all of that time together. And if together that meets the 20% threshold, then you probably have to register. The person who registers would be the most senior officer of the corporation. So even if they're not the one doing all of the communicating, it is the senior officer of the corporation that has to register. I'm on to the next slide. Perfect. The deadline to file is the 15th day of the month following when you reach the threshold. Now, those are all technical rules. You know, as I said at the outset, my view is you really have to have the conversation as an organization. And if you're going to do this kind of advocacy work, and if you think that you're likely to be anywhere near 20% of the time of one person, then in my view, it's important to have a serious look at registration, because at the end of the day, you want to be on the right side of the controversy. And being on the right side of the controversy, should one arise, and I'm not suggesting that they do arise, in fact, but if one should arise, you want to be the organization that voluntarily registered and was transparent from the get-go. Much of the, I want to say, controversy around political activities in the past with CRA arose because of complaints and arose because of media scrutiny after the fact. And my experience through those controversies is you certainly take the wind out of the sails of anybody who wants to criticize your engagement in advocacy if you have voluntarily registered in advance. Again, if you're engaging me to argue the technicalities and the niceties, you've probably lost the public relations war. Now, I'm not a communications specialist, but that's just the view of a lawyer on the sidelines on this one. If we could move on to the next slide. In terms of what that means, registration, right? You have to provide reports on a monthly basis. And as I said already, you have to, be clear about who you're talking to and identify who you're talking to and whether they qualify as a designated public office holder under, in this instance, the federal lobbying rules. And if you're interested, at the end of this presentation, I provide you with a number of links. And if you're considering registration, I'd encourage you to go to the website and look. The information that's actually provided, that's disclosed, is really quite banal and certainly isn't the kind of information I think that would put the reputation of an organization at risk. It simply, discloses that a communication took place with a particular public office holders. Moving on quickly, because I'm mindful I want to leave some time at the end. If we look at the rules in Ontario, the registration, and this is really just as a for instance, but I'm also mindful that we're heading into an election period in Ontario as well. So people might be engaging a little more heavily. I just encourage you to note that for the Ontario rules, the threshold is a collective 50 hours, right? So that's not a high threshold at all. and that's the threshold for in-house lobbyists. Here it's 2 months from the beginning, so the timing of registration is a little different. The definition of public office holder is broader. So it includes any employees of a ministry of the government of Ontario. So not just ministers, deputy ministers, that kind of thing. Employees in ministers' offices. If you move to the next slide, it includes the OPP, members of the OPP. So forward another one. It includes Ontario Power and officers or employees of a whole host of Ontario public agencies. So if you're engaging in Ontario, I just suggest that the legislation there is quite broad. And if you think you've escaped any requirement to register at the federal level, and you do work in Ontario in respect of Ontario-specific issues, then you more than likely would be required to register in Ontario. I wanted to very quickly get to the next slide because, as I said from the beginning, some of these technical rules aren't as relevant, certainly for a primer and overview of the legislation. Really, it's a conversation that the organization that needs to have before or during, at the very least, the kinds of activities that they're now, permitted to do because of the change to the CRA rules. First, if you're having that conversation, ask yourself what rules are relevant for us, for the most part, because I'm not suggesting you have the conversation without regard to the appropriate rules, but it depends on the organization and the kind of work that they do, which rules are most relevant. Do you need to register then, is the question. Is what we're doing lobbying? So are we engaging in these direct communications and in those mass communications that might trigger registration? If you're not, then maybe you don't have to register at all. Who are we communicating with? Is it a public office holder within the meaning of the definition in the relevant statute? Here again, mindful of more mass media kind of communications, because there it counts because it's assumed you're trying to influence a minister. And then what is the minimum threshold? Are we near it? Are we over it? And maybe even do we want to register anyway because we want to be seen to be a good corporate citizen? You know, in my experience, I have clients where the head of the organization is just very visible at all of these meetings and consultations and the like. And while if you actually did a careful addition of the time that's spent, they might not meet the threshold because no other staff is doing it. But the view was, we're good corporate citizens, we want to register and we want to be transparent. So we're going to, incur the added expense and administrative hassle to demonstrate that we are participating and engaging in accordance with the rules. In any event, so those are some of the questions you ask yourself as an organization. Who registers? As I said already, the most senior paid person of the organization is the one who registers. What are the risks of not registering? First, it's important to note that failing to comply with the rules is generally considered an offense, and there are penalties, including fines, perhaps, imprisonment, more importantly, perhaps a lobbying ban, right? And we have certainly seen offenses committed on behalf of charities, and there have been court cases involving charities. So it's important to be aware of that. I think the more important risk is one related to loss of reputation and credibility, right? As I've said already a couple of times, registration is considered the ethical and transparent thing to do. And I just feel that you lose the communications battle if you're relying on a technical application of the lobbying registration rules. It's much easier to be registered, and that just takes, as I said, the wind out of the sails of anybody who wants to criticize your actions on that basis. Depending on the timing, it's also, as I've said already, important not to forget federal and provincial election compliance. These rules really do interact, and something that might be okay under lobbying rules might not be okay because we're in the run-up to an election or during the writ period. Another topic for another day, but it's important, particularly now, because we're in that sort of period at the federal and Ontario level, but those rules are there, and you need to be mindful of those rules. As I've already said, who, how much, when, is it charitable? Is it lobbying, or is it, an election problem? And I thought I'd close with just an example, in my view, that illustrates sort of the complexity of getting too technical about some of this. But it's a fairly, I think, banal example. And I think it's an example of the work that many, many, many organizations. So a charity is just simply distributing a research report. Either you've commissioned the work, you've done the work, and you want to distribute this research report. If you're distributing it to supporters or the public, it's a charitable activity. Absolutely. It's not lobbying. It might be regulated under surveys, election advertising, issue related. So that might be a problem. If you're distributing the research report to election candidates, charitable. It's not lobbying unless the candidates are also public office holders, ministers, in Ontario, MPs, right? It's not necessarily regulated during an election. Believe it or not, it's okay to give your research report to candidates. Parliamentary committee, charitable, not lobbying as long as your communications stays confined to the hearing, not regulated. MPs, charitable, it's lobbying, however, okay. Online, so you put the research report up online, it's considered charitable. It's not lobbying unless you've got some associated social media campaign with it, but it also might be regulated during an election. And that's the sort of illustration I wanted to leave you with, of not just the complexity, because I don't want everybody going, oh my gosh, I've got to get a legal opinion on every single activity I do. I think it's really intended there to demonstrate that to get into the technicalities, perhaps the easier way to proceed is just simply to register and be transparent. Because when it comes to the lobbying legislation, it's not no, you can't do it. Your requirement is just simply to register and report if those kinds of activities meet the thresholds. That was the last slide, as I've already indicated to you, is just some of the resources. So some of the things that I find useful when I'm trying to discern, is it lobbying, is it not, should we register? The various regulators have really good materials on their website. Lobbying at the federal level at a glance is a really helpful step-by-step exercise with checklists if you want to ask yourselves some of the questions. The next link is the actual registry, as I noted. Might be helpful if you're wondering, click on the link, take a look at what others have done and what registration looks like from a disclosure perspective. Note also that if you're a lobbyist at the federal level, there is a code of conduct. And so once you're registered, you have to do so in an ethical way. And it talks about gifts and those sorts of things. The overview for Ontario and their guide is there. And then here again, most of our major municipalities have lobbying rules. And so I've just provided you with the link for the City of Toronto, just in case you were curious. So those, I think, are my general remarks to start with. I think next we were going to open for questions, but Sarah or Abra, you may want to chime in at this time.
Indeed. Thank you, Karen. Wow. You have shared a ton of information and insight around definitions and process and things for us to think of, practical considerations, of which there are many. Thank you for sharing such a wealth of knowledge and experience in such a concise way. I encourage our viewers to submit their questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We have had one very specific and practical question, Karen, submitted by an audience member, which is, over which period of time should the percentage of time dedicated to lobbying be calculated?
So it's a year, right? But the year can change. It's not a calendar year necessarily, right? It's really as soon as you hit within a year, that threshold, then you have the obligation. So, February, you may have 10 hours, right? And March, you hit another 40, right? Then within 2 months, you have to register.
Okay. Hopefully that is, yeah, I think that answers the question quite beautifully. I don't know where the person's coming from, but that's great. Thank you. What would you say, Karen, is the most important consideration foundations need to consider if they would like to engage in political activities and lobbying? Is there such a thing as one piece of advice that that you yourself you find yourself giving, something that is obvious to you, obviously with your experience, but will not be to people coming at this from a more exploratory way, or seeing if this is the right thing for them?
I think Sarah actually said it. There is nothing in this legislation that prohibits any of this, nor is there under the Income Tax Act at this moment, right? And that, I think, remains a misunderstanding. CRA says you can do it, so go do it. And lobbyist registration doesn't say no, you can't. It just says you need to be transparent when you're communicating with public office holders. So I think that's really, the important thing to remember. I also would add, what I hear a lot is, oh, it's a pain in the neck and I have to keep records and, really. And, on that one, as a charity lawyer, tax lawyer, yeah, that's just the way of the world these days. Particularly when it comes to ethics and transparency. Today they're talking about 3 instances of fraud in, federal procurement processes. So the regulatory environment for organizations that are engaging with government is just going to get more complex. And so you better start getting used to keeping track of these things.
Okay. That actually segues nicely to another question that has been shared, which is for individuals who are new to lobbying, with the term is used, like the revolving door of government offices. How do you know who to reach out to? Do you have advice for identifying the right person?
I think that's probably a better question for Sarah than me. I do know in Ontario, they have a really helpful piece on their website that actually tracks for people trying to comply, the changing hats that different individuals are wearing. So there's a handy dandy tool that I have pulled up on occasion, but maybe Sarah has better advice than me on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question. It really depends on the issue that you're working on and what you're trying to do. So if the issue is a federal issue, then you're going to want to reach out to bureaucrats or MPs or ministerial staff, related to that issue. If it's municipal, like it depends on the issue. I'll give a plug right now. So lobbying and the rules around lobbying are a little bit different than government relations strategy, obviously. So that's this question kind of is verging in that kind of in that area. But I will give a plug for folks who are interested in engaging in the political process as charities, but don't really know how to do it. I'm part of a program with the Max Bell Foundation, who's one of PFC's members, and they have a really cool program called the Public Policy Training Institute, where they have, they bring folks like charity leaders from across Canada together every year to learn about how to do public policy. And even though I've been working in the sector for a long time, I'm actually still learning a lot. And so I'd encourage folks who are interested to check that out. Also, Maitri, another member of PFC, offers a similar program here in Toronto that they may want to consider looking at. But the reason why I bring these up, in addition to the fact that they're great resources, is one of the learnings or one of the pieces of advice that the faculty at the Max Bell Foundation program is telling me about, like, who to reach out to. They always say, you might want to start off with like the person who's on, the lowest rung within an office, because they, well, first of all, they're more likely to take your meeting or to listen to you. And they're usually the person that has to be, that a higher level bureaucrat or politician will reach out to say, like, tell me more about this issue, write me a briefing note, whatever. And so it might be a consideration to think about in terms of like who to reach out to. So when I'm done talking, I'll put the links in the chat for those two programs. But I honestly highly recommend it, because it's also nice to build a network with other people who work in charities who are also doing public policy work.
Great, thank you both. If you're registered as a lobbyist, when one is registered as a lobbyist, does it prohibit your organization from obtaining funding from government grants?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. It, in fact, is telling folks that, you're out there and you're compliant and you're being transparent that you're asking for the money. And in fact, it's probably the reverse, because you're demonstrating compliance and you're not putting the funder at risk.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely concur with that. I think, there is this, some people think like lobbying is a dirty thing, but like I tried to really underscore at the beginning, it really is critical and it's an essential part of democracy. Like civil society has to inform government, and lobbying is a big part of that. And so nobody's going to look at you negatively because you're registered as a lobbyist and you're also asking for funding. It's about informing people about really important issues who are making people who can make decisions on big public policy issues.
And certainly the question, I think, discloses one of the other misconceptions that's out there, that if I disclose and if I'm transparent, that somehow this is a bad thing. It's going to be viewed as me doing something I'm not supposed to do or what have you, when my view is it's the reverse entirely. And I'd encourage, as I've done, go look, see, it's not that bad. And you'll also, I think, see an increasing number of organizations that are registering as lobbyists. And you'll see many of your colleagues go, oh, they are.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Anecdotally, I'm definitely seeing that. And we're at PFC, we're getting more and more interest from members and other folks in the network and the wider sector, asking us questions and being interested in issues relating to any kind of political activity, evidenced by the interest in this webinar and other things. So it definitely is becoming more and more a critical part of what it means to be a charity and how to make a difference.
So as we near the end of the hour, is there one important idea that you wish to make sure you are leaving the participants with here today? And if so, what would it be?
You go, Sarah.
Well, I mean, I've made a few really important points and tried to underscore a number of things, but I mean, one thing I'll say is I don't think it's as hard as people think it is. And you know, we at PFC, we engage in policy work. We are registered as lobbyists, and it's not that complicated. You're putting meetings in your calendar anyway. A lot of it's already recorded. It's not that big of a deal. So I don't want, like, you know, yes, like we have to make sure we're you know, on board with the rules or above board with the rules, but it's not that complicated. So that I really hope is not a deterrent for people.
And I wanted Sarah to go first because I completely, totally agree. If I have to be involved, then you've missed the boat and you've really missed the opportunity. Certainly involve me if you want a detailed understanding of a particular jurisdiction and is a particular activity going to trigger, you know, the requirement to register. But this is really much more of a, I want to say, philosophical kind of question to answer. If you're going to do it, then you should be doing it right. And doing it right means registering. And that's really, you know, the message that I wanted folks to take home.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Karen Cooper, for your time and for sharing your professional guidance. It was so wonderful to have you with us today. Thank you to Sarah for organizing this session and for your participation today. And of course, to everyone who engaged with us on this important topic and participated in the discussion. PFC wishes to thank the Trottier Family Foundation for supporting this initiative and for your foundation's ongoing support of and our contributions to our network and the philanthropic community at large. I wish to thank Justin, our interpreter, who's been working his magic in the background. And also to say, in addition to our conference, we have a number of interesting events and meetings for members and other grant makers, grant-making foundations, I should say, in the works for 2024. So I invite you to take a look at pfc.ca for our events and programming. And thanks everyone who joined us today, both for your interest in this topic and for your participation. So I'll say, stay safe and bye for now, and enjoy the rest of the week. Thank you. See you next time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks.